copy streaming link, and then I'll just go. I hope I don't lose you.
Well, we'll see what happens.
I shouldn't.
Okay.
What's your Twitter is just Troy, right? And then I'll just go Troy Project Pastor.
Yeah. That's.
I hope I don't lose you.
Well, we'll see what happens. I just closed that up. So you chat. There's the.
All right.
There's a link.
Yeah, I think I've already shared that. That's what I just shared.
Cool.
Should be good. Should be good.
All right. This is already starting, but it's fine. So we will go.
Fun times.
Yes. Hey, welcome to This Undivided Life, fighting together to make life whole again. I am on with my good friend. At least I can call him. I think I can call you your friend, right?
You can call me your friend. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Seth Haines. Hey, I just love you. I was going to read from it, and what I really love about it is you actually don't talk in the third person. You say I am, and there's a real connection there. You say I'm a writer and photographer who loves the Ozarks, my wife and 4 boys, and a good collection of poems. I'm the author of 2 books, both of which touch on addiction, sobriety, and spiritual formation. The book of Waking Up, Experiencing Divine Love that Reorders a Life, which is what we're going to talk about today, and the award-winning book, Coming Clean: A Story of Faith. And I wrote this out because if I said it, it wouldn't sound as good. I'm a bit jealous of your ability to write. You have the unique ability to write as if it were a dish created at Thomas Keller's The French Laundry, but also the skill of writing that is home house, kind of exquisite meets ordinary, refined meets comfort, both extraordinary, both having you walk away completely satisfied, although one may cause you a bit more heartburn. So there you go. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. I will say today I'm having a little bit of internet issues, so if I cut in and out, I think I heard about 92% of what you just said. I very much appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you. Well, let's start. I want to start out with this question. This is a new question I've been starting out with. What meal or meals recently in the past have you had that has had a profound effect on you?
So on Easter, I'm glad you asked that question. That is a phenomenal question. On Easter, we're all kind of locked away. We can't attend church services. And Easter was kind of a big day for my family. We were anticipating walking into sort of a new church journey on Easter, and that's been on hold because obviously we're not meeting. So on Easter, we did our best to really have a big feast, a celebration, to try to bring a little bit of life and joy back to it. And so we made a wine braised lamb shank, and it was so good. It was so fun to cook. It was so fun to do. It was so fun to participate in sort of the sacramental life by taking the good things of the earth and cooking them in a way that would be, enjoyable for everybody. It's weird to say that a meal that you cooked had a profound impact on you, but it kind of did have a profound impact because it was the recognition that like some of these things that we love and that we enjoy and that we would pay a lot of money for if we went out to eat, we have to start like creating those things ourselves and learning how to share those with our cloistered community, our sort of domestic monastic community, if you will, as some have been putting it lately. So I think that's the meal that's had the most profound impact on me lately, because it just reminds me like, hey, we have a responsibility to bring the good things of the earth into our home, even when we're sort of isolated from each other.
No, that's really good. You just talked about responsibility of bringing these things in. What are some of the other ways? I mean, you just talked about that. What are some of the other ways we can do that, especially in a time like now?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're not perfect in this house, but one of the things that again, like when you're out of community, you don't have community anymore. You're out of that sort of connective tissue that makes up the church or that makes up a spiritual community. Um, you're kind of left with whomever is, that's like who's in your house. That's what
Hmm.
you're left with.
Right.
And so Amber and I have really been trying hard, and some days are better than others, to connect for spiritual rhythms throughout the day, sort of almost monastic type rhythms. So morning prayers, noonday prayers, evening prayers. Those are the good things of life. This connection with God in community, we're missing that. So we're trying to bring that into our home through creating our own domestic community. I think too a lot about literature and art. You know, these are things we can always participate in, inside or outside of a COVID pandemic.
Right.
But I
Right.
think it's more important than ever right now to really, really celebrate and bring good art into your house and celebrate each other's art. In fact, Amber's doing a phenomenal job of this right now. She's, curating a little community that shares art once a month, the creation of their own art, in kind of an online space, that sort of helps others say, like, here's the offering that I have of art, and let's celebrate each other through that. So I think for us, it's mostly about recognizing the things that we're missing: communities of prayer, celebration of art and community, good meals together, and sort of incorporating those back into our daily rhythms.
Now, were some of those things you did as a kid, some of these meals and things around the table? I mean, was that part of your heritage?
Oh, totally. So, yeah, I grew up in Arkansas, in the just kind of the southern tip of the Ozarks, but my family's all from Louisiana. We moved to Arkansas, I think, when I was 6. Um, but in Louisiana, like, there's never you don't need an excuse for a good party. Everything's a good party, and and there's always, good beer, good liquor, good food. It's good wine. It's just a way of life down there. And my family has always kind of carried that Louisiana vibe with them up into the Ozarks. My mom's also a literature teacher. And so literature and art were always a part of growing up. Music was always a big part of growing up. And so these things have always been with me through my childhood. Good meal, good cooking, which, by the way, all the men did in my family, for whatever reason. So good cooking, good literature, good art, and then obviously spiritual community. These have been things that have been sort of the fabric of who I am from the beginning. Even though I probably wouldn't have thought of that had you not asked the question.
Well, did you have any? And because I have these memories too. Do you have any memories where you walked into your house, even recently, where there was a smell that evoked, especially coming from the kitchen, that just evoked either a memory or just something that was, a recognition. Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, I mean, anytime I smell garlic, garlic is an immediate return to being 6. So anything like, we in Louisiana, there's a lot of braising. A ton of braising happens. A lot of stewing happens, and all of it involves tomatoes and garlic and wine. And so I think those sort of smells always kind of bring me back to my childhood as a kid, particularly when I would go visit my grandpa who lived in northern Louisiana. He would take me to go get cinnamon rolls, and he would take me to get cinnamon rolls at Grandy's, which is this fried chicken place that's in the South. Kind of terrible in a lot of ways, but they used to put raisins in their cinnamon rolls, and I just remember, like, how exquisite and extravagant it was, just that additional little that addition of a raisin in your cinnamon roll. I don't make raisin cinnamon rolls. I now think that's kind of heresy, but as a result, that idea of the cinnamon roll, it kind of became this comforting food, the staple food to me. And so now, as I've gotten older, I've started to make those from scratch at home. We did those Easter morning, in fact. And that's another one of those smells that the minute I smell a homemade cinnamon roll, I'm just transported back to my childhood, back to the place of comfort. It's fascinating how smells do that for you.
No, you said your grandpa, when you went with your grandpa, are there any particular memories you have of that? You said you're going with him, but maybe even conversations that you had as you went to go get your cinnamon rolls.
Yeah, my grandfather was very crass man, and so also very religious. He was Episcopalian, and those two things are not mutually exclusive in the Episcopalian Church, which I appreciate and love. So most of the conversations that my grandfather and I would have could either not be said on air on live, or it was more the impression. I got more of an impression from him than anything. But when I was probably 7, 8, 9, we would go visit him. He was a man of means. He had some money, but he had this old three on the tree green Chevy, a truck,
Okay.
and I don't know why he drove it, but he did. It was kind of a, on the weekends, it was kind of his working man's truck. And I would always get up early. I've always been an early riser. And he would say, "Come on, boy, let's go get some cinnamon rolls." Sometimes it was powdered donuts. And we'd go get in that big green beater that had no seat belts, because it's,
You'd slide
1985 or
around on
whatever.
that bench
Oh,
seat or
yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, the bench seat that's made of false leather, pleather,
You're right.
and I just remember him shifting that three on the tree, and we would go get cinnamon rolls or donuts, and then he would take me out to the bayou, which for those of you who are not from the South, a bayou is simply just a slow moving lake. It's a connected series of connected lakes that move slowly based on the rise and fall of water table levels. And on the bayous in North Louisiana, they had a significant problem in my childhood with a ground cover, a water cover called duckweed. I'm sure there's a better name for it. But my grandfather would always talk about the duckweed and how it was the responsibility of the community to make sure that the land, that the bayous were kept pristine and beautiful. And this duckweed was sort of a nuisance, right? And so he would organize people to on a Saturday to go and sort of clean up the duckweed, to spray it or to scrape it off the surface of the water. And he would talk a lot about how conservation and care for the environment is really a community effort. And those are kind of the earliest conversations I remember with my grandfather, were really conversations around nature, around conservation, around community effort, and always over cinnamon rolls or powdered donuts.
There you go. Well, did that help your direction later on in life? I mean, your connection to the environment, and like you just talked about. I don't know if we went record or whatever. You're talking about being at the pond and near your backyard or wherever it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for my wife Amber, she grew up in kind of a similar way, although she was a country girl, so in Alabama, and I think for her that call to nature has been a little bit more explicit, if that makes sense. I've always been a very interior person. I like to write. I like to think, and I do a lot of that inside. And I always have. I like to read. I do a lot of that inside. So for me, it's actually, I actually have to I love it. Like, I thrive outside, but I actually have to kind of make myself break out of my own head and get out into nature, get out into God's creation and celebrate the goodness of the earth. I told you I like to cook. I love to cook.
Right.
Again, that's an inside activity, right? So for me, I really do have to be more intentional with that. And the older I get, the more intentional I am, and the more it reminds me of really my grandfather's life, who was an office man and a thinker, a deep thinker, but always took the time and the intention to get outside and to celebrate the creation of God.
No, you said something really. You mentioned a couple times intention. Why is intention or intentionality important when it may be even reflective in a time like we are in today about doing some of these things that, in a sense, provide self care for us.
Yeah, so that's a that's a question that I've really been wrestling down since we've been in the middle of this pandemic, all locked away. Um, there was a time not too long ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, when life just kind of happened,
Hmm.
right? You wake up, and the boss sets your schedule, and watches over your shoulder and makes sure that you're getting your work done, and gives you the lunch hour break, and yada and so forth and so on. but now we're kind of all left to our own vices, so to speak. Now we're all in our houses. The accountability levels are lower. That's actually seen in several things. Accountability levels being lower, the rise in day drinking and the sales of alcohol, the rise in the sales of sex toys, actually, rise in the use of pornography. We are more left to our vices, more isolated than we ever have been. And what we found, and this is part of why we in our house instituted this rhythm of daily morning, noonday, and evening prayers. What we found is that if we're going to make it through this season with some modicum of mental health and stability, we have to act with intention. We have to live life on purpose. And so we do things with very great intention. I have a schedule actually that I kind of follow throughout the day that sets out what I do in my morning time, when we do our prayers, what I do with my morning work, when we break for lunch and noonday prayers, what I do for my afternoon work, then how we exercise and make sure that we're staying physically healthy, and how we recreate, and when we cook. Um, and those things really do keep us accountable to try to be the best versions of ourselves, and to be mentally stable and aware and cognizant of each other, as we're all kind of locked into this house together. It is truly a domestic monastery.
Well, part of that too, right? I mean, I know some of your past, your worship leader, right, and music was, part of your background. Isn't part of this reestablishing a rhythm that maybe we were just knocked out of? We just didn't know it.
Yeah, totally, 100%. I mean, I think there are things that I really love about both music and poetry, and that maybe nonfiction and fiction don't quite do as well. With poetry, you have confined spaces, you have boxes, you have certain meters. In certain types of poetry, you have parameters. In music, you kind of, for the most part, have the same thing. You have structure, you have parameters, you have rhythms, you have chord patterns. And those rhythms and those sort of structures, they don't just lock you in. They give you guidelines, if that makes sense. um, Guidelines for your expression, for your creativity, but they keep you in the I don't know, in the groove, so to speak. And maybe fiction and nonfiction don't do that. You can kind of wander wherever you want, do whatever you want, say whatever you want. And I feel like we have lost the rhythm and the structure. We kind of all just do what we want, and maybe this is a callback to that sort of rhythm and structure.
Well, some of that too, right? Is I think sometimes we felt maybe, and this I'm sure this is personal to me, but I think this is true that we felt like, oh, if we were in a box, we don't have room to be creative. But you just talked about poems and music, right? Look at all the creativity that comes out of those, and that's kind of like you said, a structure.
I think we hung up a little bit there, but I think
We
you were
did, we
saying this.
did.
You're saying
Um,
the there's a lot of beauty that comes out of the rhythm and the structure of poetry and music. I think that's true. And in the same way, I think about it's funny. There's a Christiana Peterson. I think she's on Twitter. I saw her sort of musing about. I think she's Stina KC. Maybe I don't. Maybe that I don't know. Maybe that's no. That's somebody else. Anyway, you should all go look up Christiana Peterson. She was quoting a Rollheiser book about the domestic monastery. And before I saw that, Amber and I had been talking a lot, and I'd been watching a lot of videos on Benedictine monasteries. There's one down the road from here, about 2 hours, where we've been talking about going on a spiritual retreat. And I think about within the Benedictine monasteries, they have these rules of living, these ways of living that are oriented around prayer, work, study, and leisure. And when you look at the beauty that comes out of those monasteries, whether it's art or amazing products, sometimes a monastery will have an incredible woodworking shop or a bakery or a beer making, facility. When you look at some of the amazing creativity that comes out of there, they're not sort of hemmed in by
mm,
the rules. They're
Right.
not hemmed in by that rule of life, that way of being. The domestic rhythm that they've adopted allows them greater creativity because they know I have this uninterrupted block of time to be absolutely creative.
Well, you mentioned something too that I don't think we've kind of put leisure into all of our time. I think in the modern sense, many times because we carry around a phone, we got this entertainment thing that will connect us with us. How good is it maybe for us to kind of pry away from that a bit, maybe put the phone down or the screen down, and have intentional time. It's still leisure, but intentionally being away from that.
Yeah, I think it's vitally important. I mean, if I, if Amber were watching this or my kids were watching this, they would say, yeah, that is vital, Dad. You need to do it more. I think that if there's one area of my life where I do feel a complete lack of discipline since this has all shown up, it's that, I really am on my phone way more than I'd like to think I am. My underlying statistics show that, even though we know it's not healthy and we know it robs from creativity. In fact, last Monday, so a week ago this Monday, one of the goals that I wrote down was to eliminate some of my screen time in two or three very particular ways, so as to kind of recapture some of that creativity, and it's been super helpful. um, in the mornings when I try to do the majority of my writing time, I don't have my phone near me, and that's very intentional. Now that's like an hour and a half of my day, and the rest of the time it's like in my pocket all the time. So I need to work on
Right.
that. But
Right.
but I do think that this is the big distractor of the day and the distractor of the age, and it functions in some ways as a modern addiction that's socially acceptable.
Right, right. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Cal Newport. He's got a couple of really good books that have dealt with the deep work and the digital minimalism.
Yeah.
And both of those have been really impactful on me. But getting back to books, here is the book that we're going to talk about today. I know it's like 30 minutes in. It's like, you haven't even asked one question about the book, but I think
Oh,
we can.
it's cool. I like this.
Yeah. Um, but you, and I'm going to reference kind of a monastery, Richard Rohr book. He wrote a book called Breathing in Water, Spirituality and the 12 Steps. And he says, I think your heart needs to be broken up at least once to have a heart at all, or to have a heart for others. What, if anything, has broken you, not only to have a broken and supple heart toward yourself, but also a heart towards others?
Yeah, I think anyone who has actually come to grips with their own addiction, has had this very experience. I think that's why you talk about the grace and the 12 steps. I mean, this is the very thing for me. Before I struggled with my own alcohol problem. I've written about that in Coming Clean, and I've written about it again in a different sort of way in the book of Waking Up. One is more of a memoir. One is more of a general look at our habits, our coping mechanisms, the way that we can leave those behind and connect with the divine love. That's the book of Waking Up. But through my own journey and through seeing that, before probably 6 years ago, I was very self disciplined. I was very sort of black and white. I pretty much thought I had everything under control. I had very little grace to give. Um, but after you go through this experience, you see that like life does what it does. And sometimes it does it to you. and and
Right.
when it does it to you, and you get on the other side of that, you begin to see things a lot differently. You begin to have a lot more grace for people maybe who are dealing with addiction. And that's not to say that um, I don't still have problems when somebody has a destructive habit or coping mechanism that's hurtful and harmful to my family or to me. That doesn't mean I still can't go back into some of those black and white modes of thinking, um, but at the end of the day, I think, when we recognize that we're not any different than anyone else, that we have our own habits, we have our own coping mechanisms, and when we realize that those habits and coping mechanisms, whether it's alcohol or shopping or gambling or porn use or whatever the thing is, when we begin to realize that those all actually operate on the same neuroscience and the same brain science, then we can begin to have a lot more grace on others because we see that we're really no different. Our vices may be more socially acceptable, but at the end of the day, we are all in need of love. We are all in need of mercy. We are all in need of forgiveness.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in the book was there was a woman, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about her addiction to food and how it's and that's something you have to do every day as opposed
Yeah.
to and just talk about this idea of some of these other addictions that we maybe you don't even think about. And I know you mentioned some of them in the book.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, phone addiction is one of them, right? I mean,
Right.
I'm using my phone right now, and I have it all the time on me. But I think the food was a good one because I was talking to this woman, and I'll tailor my language a little bit. I'll make my language a little bit more clean than it was in the book. But we were talking, and she said, "You're the luckiest guy in the room." And I said, "Why is that?" And she said, "Because I have this eating disorder. And so, whereas you can walk away from alcohol, I can't walk away from food. That's actually the problem. I have to
Mm,
eat food."
right.
And that was actually the moment where my thinking began to shift and to change a little bit. And I actually began asking in my own life, is the question to like never have another drink again? To never enjoy wine with my wife again? Maybe it is. But maybe there's a bigger question than to drink or not to drink. Maybe the question is, how do we have appropriate relationships with everything in our lives such that they are ordered under God and such that they draw us deeper into a relationship with the divine love of God? And that was a question as I continued to do my research and my reading on that idea. That was a question that Saint Ignatius of Loyola was asking, years ago, hundreds of years ago. Um, and I think there are some good answers there. And the answer is like, none of these things are necessarily bad, so long as they're used in ways that draw you and pull you into the divine love of God, and not ways that you attempt to numb your own pain instead of bringing your pain to Him.
Well, I talked to my doctor, and he's going to be on the show in a bit. But I'd interviewed him actually a couple of months ago. But the interview will release soon. But we were talking about some of these coping things and whatnot, and he said, as kind of a distraction. But he says no. He says they've become the answer for people. That is their answer.
Yeah, yeah, and there's this author doctor that I actually quote a lot in the book named Gabor Mate, and Gabor Mate says over and over again that the question for the addict is not why the addiction, it's why the pain.
Mm,
And this idea that when we have deep pain and we don't know what to do with it, and we don't have a spiritual director, and we don't have a therapist, and we don't have a right relationship with divine love, the divine love of God, then we can turn to those things, those vices, those created things as the end, right? There's not a means to enjoy life; it's the end to numb the
mm,
pain. That's all Mate's saying, and your doctor and others have said it very well. This is the way so often that we try to deal with the pain of the world. Again, in this COVID age, we are seeing this. I've written about this actually in on my own website, but alcohol use is way up. Alcohol sales are way up. Porn use has climbed something like 12 to 15% in the first 2 to 3 weeks. I don't know what the numbers are now. In fact, some porn sites have given away platinum memberships for free because they know people are isolated, they're at home, they're bored, they're lonely, they need something, or they're looking for something to take the edge off, right?
right.
Uh, um, the demand, again, this is kind of a funny example, but the demand in the sex toy market has gone so high so fast that like the creators, the makers of them, can't keep up with the supply. Why? Because people are looking for something to take off the edge. There have already been reports about the oxycontin, or these sort of opioids
Right.
sales going up, addiction going up in this season, this time. Um, Netflix in Europe, they had to buffer the bandwidth. in certain places of Europe because Netflix was eating up so much of the bandwidth from all of the people binging shows all day long.
Right. Right.
Um, we turn to the stuff of earth in order to distract ourselves, to numb ourselves, to push the pain away, and we've been doing that since the very, very beginning of time.
Mm. No, are you familiar with Bessel van der Kolk? He wrote a book,
Mm-mm.
"The Body Keeps the Score." He's a Dutch
Oh
psychiatrist.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
I know that book.
yeah, and he says in that book, he says traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of a gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs. In an attempt to control these processes, they often become an expert at ignoring their gut feelings and numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. And you just talked about taking the edge off. Isn't that hiding from us the questions that we have internally?
100%. Very early on, I watched. There's a guy. He's actually in your neck of the woods. I think he's in Santa Barbara. He's a bishop. His name's Bishop Robert Barron, and Bishop Barron was talking about sort of the opportunity of the age. And the opportunity of the age, is sort of, he put it, was, and again, like he's saying, like, this is not coming from him. This is coming from ancient thinkers, ancient writers. This is the tradition of Christianity for years, thousands of hundreds of years, you know. But they're saying that he's saying the opportunity of the age is to take this moment, this crisis, and to begin to ask ourselves the deeper questions of life. Those deeper questions of, what is the meaning of life? What is mortality? What is the potential for my death? What comes after death? What is my connection like with my family? What is my connection like with my God? But those are really hard existential questions. I mean, questions that we have had a hard time answering for a long, long time. Um, and frankly, man, sometimes it's just easier to put on Parks and Rec and roll and not think about it. You know, sometimes
Absolutely.
it might be easier to drink a third of the Boda box, and put on Brooklyn Nine-Nine or whatever, and push it all away. But if you're not carving out the time to sit and ask those questions and invite the divine love of God into that pain with you, then you're actually not doing the hard spiritual work. And I would maybe even say you're not doing the work of being fully human.
Mm. Well, what since you kind of walk and you're still walking through this process of addiction, but what has opened up for you when you've started to ask more of these questions in your life?
I think what opens up for me is that things are a lot less about to do or not to do. It's a lot less about hanging on to some very rigid rule of sobriety. And I mean, I'm talking about rules of domestic living. So I like rules.
Right.
Um, it becomes less about that, and it becomes more about, am I enjoying all the things in the world around me only to the extent that they draw me into connection with God, and recognizing when I fail and recognizing when I do that well. This is sort of the Ignatian foundation of the principle. It's it's this idea that we were made to love, serve, and reverence God. Okay, and then to recognize that all things on earth were created to allow us to love, serve, and reverence God. And then using the created stuff of earth only to the extent that they bring us into a deeper, loving, serving, reverent relationship with the divine love of God. And this is what I've come to as, like, sort of the idea behind what is actual true sobriety. What is the sobriety that the saints talk about, that Peter talks about, that Paul talks about, that Augustine talks about, that Aquinas talks about, that Ignatius talks about? This is what I've come to believe is actually true sobriety, is picking up things so far as they connect us with God, and putting down things so long as they distract us from connecting with God.
Could we be better served in our own lives and I think Tim Ferriss was talking about this. He rather than add things to his life, he's practiced what can I take away that would add to my, in a sense, add to my life, even though I'm taking something away.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this connect again, this is sort of an Ignatian thought of the prayer of opposites. Like if there's anything that gets in the way, Lord, I pray the opposite of that. Right. So,
Right.
um, so if money is getting in the way, this is a good one. Ignatius actually uses this one. If money is getting in the way of loving, serving, and reverencing God, instead of asking what I can add to my life to make more money so that maybe I'll feel more secure, Ignatius would say, pray for poverty, pray for the opposite, do the opposite, right?
Right.
Uh, if alcohol gets in your way of loving and serving and reverencing God, and you can't seem to kick the habit, then actually pray for the opposite. Pray that you would get busted out in your over consumption of alcohol. Praying these ideas of the option, Lord, what can you take away? I think that that's a really great way to put it. And again, um, Ferris, others, Bishop Barron, me. I mean, these things are not things that they sound wise when we or they say them, but this stuff has been written about for forever. There's a wealth of wisdom there to go look and learn from. If only we'd have this sort of imagination to see it.
Yeah, I interviewed Chad Jarnigan, and he has a lot, and he has a parish in outside of Tennessee, Luminous Parish, and he talks about this idea of, he says he'll have younger, millennials come in and say, "Hey, what should I read?" And he says, "Well, I've got a bunch of books back here by a bunch of old dead people." And I point him, and he says, this stuff has been around for
Yeah,
centuries.
yeah.
So the wisdom is there. Where would you put? Let me ask you this: you've talked about some of this wisdom. Let's say somebody's listening and say, "Well, gosh, where would you point someone to?" Or I'd like to ask some of these questions and maybe read somebody that has been through some of this stuff. Where some of the places you point someone to?
Yeah, so in my book, in the book of Waking Up, I actually kind of treat it as a personal library, particularly on addiction. I cite a ton of different books in the book of Waking Up that have been really influential in the way.
This one, get it?
Yeah, that book right there. Yeah,
It's good. I've got underlines and everything in it, so it's good.
that's good. That's awesome. But hopefully you underline some of the footnotes because that's where most of the reference to the books are. So I tell people, like, go to the experts.
Hmm.
So go to, if you want a well-crafted story of sobriety and finding your way from sort of the atheism of drunkenness into the inner light of true sobriety, like, read Mary Karr. Her book Lit is perfect. She's a poet, she's an amazing memoirist. If you want somebody who's an expert in addiction, read Gabor Mate. If you want somebody who's an expert on pain, theologically speaking, read C.S. Lewis. And then in all of those books, there are always references out to older work, and just trace those lines back. I can't remember how I ended up reading the works of Saint Ignatius of Loyola and actually going through the spiritual exercises with a spiritual director, but I was led to him down a rabbit trail of other writers who referenced older writers, who referenced older writers, who referenced older writers. And all of a sudden, I'm staring down St. Ignatius saying, like, oh, you actually have some wisdom to teach me. And then through reading St.
Right.
Ignatius, I'm realizing, oh, this is actually just Aquinas. And then through reading Aquinas, realizing, oh, actually, this is Augustine. And then through reading Augustine, thinking, oh, actually, you're grabbing this from Peter and Paul. I get it.
Mm.
So I think for anybody who's serious about the work, particularly the theological work, read people who are deep thinking on the matter, and then just keep tracing their sources back and back and back. And also, don't read people who don't source.
Mm-mm. Well, even Jesus source, right? He's referencing to the Old Testament in writings there
Totally,
too.
totally, totally.
Well, as you wrote this book, um, what the process of walking through it, what in you has changed since you've written it?
I mean, other than just being more aware because of the pandemic of my own vices, probably nothing. I mean, this I was having this conversation this weekend, and it just came out in January, so there's a piece
Right.
of it where it's kind of fresh, and maybe in a
Right.
year I'll answer this differently. But I was talking to a friend yesterday, and I was saying, if I die um, tomorrow, like I'll be very proud of this work. I think I left it all on the table. Likewise, like if I never was invited to publish again, I'm very proud of this work. I feel like I left nothing on the table, and it authentically expresses sort of where I am and what I believe and who I am, and so in that way, I'm very grateful for this book. The only thing that's really, again, like I said, changed is that it continues to expose me as I do these interviews. It continues to expose me to my own areas where I need to do some more inner work. Again, like the cell phone thing, right? Like I didn't realize I had such a problem with it until all of this hit. Um,
Well,
and so that, yeah,
I'm
that
sorry.
kind of stuff.
You have a pop quiz in there in the book. And what are some of those questions in the pop quiz? And specifically, we should have be not true of every one of them, but I think it's like 90. Do you remember that one?
No, well, I mean, I remember it to some degree. When you
Okay,
write like
I'll read.
50,000 words, it's hard to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
hard to remember all of them.
Well, here it is. I'll pull my glasses down because I'm getting old. True or false? We all experience pain. True or false? We all have a reward center system which motivates us to relieve some stress, some need, or some pain. True or false? The pleasures produced by the reward center are sacramental. Mental point us to God who created those pleasures. True or false? The powers, both natural and spiritual, do everything they can to hijack our reward centers to point us to created objects instead of God who created them. And then you got a bonus question. Uh, you've experienced your own hijacking. You just talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we all do.
Right.
It's fool's folly to think that somehow the rules of humanity don't apply to us.
Right.
You know, it's fool's folly to think that we can go how many days, 60 days, 45 days, whatever it is, into a pandemic, binging Netflix shows for the whole time every night, and think somehow we're going to come out of this better than we
Right.
went into it. Um, we all experience our own hijackings, and those things have become maybe more pronounced now than ever.
Right. I mean, I've experienced more of this. I mean, I've been, and this is so weird. I listened to Mike Rowe the other day, and he says, "How do we?" He says, "I know somebody said that these are essential and these are non-essential, but when you can't go to your favorite restaurant, was that non-essential?" I mean, so and like I said, I've experienced this last week because I took some vacation off, and I've been normally working, and it was like, oh wow, this has only been a week for me. And I'm starting to, I'm feeling it. It's like, oh, okay. I kind of understand why people are so, there's a little bit of angst and worry and anxiety and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit there,
Okay.
but I got you back. But I got you back. I got you back. You were talking about the essential versus non-essential, and I do think that's kind of uh, funny. There are a lot of things that I actually think are funny when we start talking about essential and non-essential. So, for instance, I'm an attorney.
Right.
There is a state. I represent a client who is in a state that has two borders, or one border, two states. So he has
Gotcha.
stores in two different states across different borders. In one state, he cannot stay open. Both states he cannot stay open. In one state he cannot stay open, although to sell sort of he sells this sort of what would typically be considered a vice. I'll just leave it at that, a vice good.
Okay.
He
Yeah.
cannot stay open, although liquor stores can stay open.
Okay.
In the other state, liquor stores are not considered essential. And so it's funny to me even to see on a state by state level how we're deciding like what is essential and what is non-essential, right? Liquor is essential. Is liquor really essential? And the rationale for that being, well, people go through withdrawals and then they put additional strain on the medical community, and I understand that. I get that.
Right.
But these are the questions of the day, and the question that we're really asking is, are our addictions essential?
Ooh.
Is my desire to not cook the meal that I love at my favorite restaurant because I would have to learn something, or I don't know how to do it, or it's more painful, or it's just not as comforting. Um, is that, does that somehow morph what is truly non-essential? and has
Mm,
been for thousands of years, into something that is essential? No, but we want it to be.
right. Well, you said something and it was really interesting. Somehow more comfortable, right?
Yeah.
We're looking for comfort, but not. I think we're looking for comfort if we realize that it's not just jumping on our couch and watching a Netflix movie. There's something more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? About why do I make the cinnamon rolls? When I make a cinnamon roll, somehow I am transported back to being six.
Mm,
Why do I eat cereal at night? Again, I mean, my fondest memories of cereal are at my grandfather's house in northern Louisiana at the bar at 8:30 at night. It's kind of the last thing before bed, talking with my grandmother about, whatever, sometimes spiritual things, sometimes non-spiritual things. And somehow when I eat that cinnamon roll, when I eat that bowl of cereal, I'm transported back to a place where I was safe, I was loved, I was cared for, I was comfortable, and I was comforted. And I think that's what we're all kind of trying to do is get back to that place of comfort. It's sort of trying to recreate Eden, as it were. But sometimes we do it in really wonky ways.
you think that's really the heart of God to bring us back, to, even on this earth with all of its imperfections and all of its problems, to bring us back to those places of comfort and you said safety?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think this is why I do make intention to go out in nature, as we talked about earlier. There's one thing in nature that is all that, like, I've always been 100% about. Like, in the minute I see it, I'll go out to it, and watch, and that's birds. I love birds. I'm not like a birder, but I love watching birds fly and land and peck around at the ground and get up in a tree branch. And this morning, as I was working, a cardinal came down. There's a pew right outside the window where I work, and he came down and she was actually, I know it was a female. The female lighted right on the edge of that pew and was kind of looking at the glass through. It was the weirdest thing. And I was just locked. I was transfixed. And I think the reason that, um, for me, that is a draw to nature is because it really is that callback to the scriptures. Like, look at the birds of the air. Like, do they worry? Are they worried about where they're going to get their next meal or where they're going to
Right.
rest? No, they never seem to worry. um, it is the complete, it's the place of complete safety for the bird, is out in nature. And it's just a recollection that God has really created this world for our good and for our pleasure and ultimately for our safety, even though we, do our best to screw that up.
And isn't that some of that? I mean, I see the reminder. I come in and we have these barn swallows that have come. I think they've been 8 or 9 years. They've got a little place under this alcove of our front porch, right? And of course, they'll dive bomb you as you come underneath there if they got the babies in there. But how can we? How can? Let me ask you this: how can we improve our vision of seeing that, where God just puts a mirror out and says, "Hey, look at this."
Again, intention. I mean, so one of the things that, again, Amber and I've been doing is going on these walks in this season, and we've seen some really weird stuff that we've never seen before. Like, there's this really weird, round, kind of orangey spongy fungus that's growing on this tree. It actually grows like a in the shape of a ball and kind of hangs from the tree. It's really bizarre looking, and I've never seen anything like that before. One of my sons, my second born Jude, when we go out on these walks, he'll point out to the mushrooms. I think we've been given, again, a great opportunity to explore the world in a different way, in a new way. I mean, we're not together, we're not distracted all the time. We don't have to be distracted all the time. I, for instance, am not driving 25 minutes one way to work and 25 minutes back. So I've picked up 50 minutes of time to go on these walks, to do these sorts of things. A lot of my midday lunches have gone away. So again, I can go on these walks during lunch. I think part of what we just have to do is just be intentional and say, in this season, I'm going to do what it takes to explore the goodness of God in the land of the living, as the psalmist said. And whether that's through creation, whether that's through, learning a new culinary skill in the kitchen, It's serving the divine love of God by serving your family a good meal. Whether that's through really diving into good art and good literature, whatever that is, I think it takes intention right now to really seek out the good things of God in this world and let those things draw you closer into that divine love.
Well, as we're wrapping up, I know you're a photographer, so I'm going to ask you this question. This is going to be a fun one for you.
So are you.
Desert
You're
Island,
also you're also a
yes.
photographer.
Desert Island. You get one camera. What are you taking?
Oh man, this is a really hard question because I do feel like currently I'm on a desert island and I have a so I shoot a Fuji X100 S
Okay.
second edition. It's old,
Okay.
and if you know,
Right.
it's an old rangefinder style
In the
camera
Leica tradition, yes.
in the Leica tradition. And right now it's breaking down. Like I
Oh
can
no.
sense it. Like the on off switch has started to do weird things. A lot of ghosting in the battery. The focus ring is getting really stuck. And so I'm now contemplating, do I get the new Fuji X-T4 or do I get the new Fuji X100V, which is the same version of
Yes.
the camera that I have, just the newer
Right.
version.
Right.
Um, so I'm really stuck because I love it goes back to poetry and music, the limitations of that
Of
X100.
correct.
You can't change the lens. You have a
Right.
fixed focal length. You have to get in closer for a closer shot, get back farther for a farther shot.
Well, you can always just get
That
a fixed lens on the XT4 and go do
you
the same
you
thing.
you can, but it's not the same because then I know I
Right.
can actually buy zoom lenses and things
Right.
like that,
Right.
right? So
Yes.
it's a little bit different. Um,
Yeah.
so I think if you were going to say you have to go, you're going to be on a deserted island. The only thing you can have is one camera, and you can import all the images back, for people to look at from your deserted island. I think I would probably choose the Leica version of that rangefinder camera,
Gotcha. Well, what? Okay. So
or
there's
the
your there's
Hasselblad,
yeah.
maybe a
Yeah.
Hasselblad.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I it could I have like a 10,000 bucks or maybe 30,000 bucks?
Yeah. Nice.
So maybe then I do that.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other question would be, what two books would you bring with you? Nonfiction and a fiction book.
Oh well, the fiction. Oh golly, can I bring two fiction books instead?
Certainly fiction.
Um, okay, so nonfiction is brutally hard because it depends. Like so much nonfiction depends on what you classify as nonfiction and then what I'm
Right.
in the
Right.
mood for. I think I would probably bring. See, I don't know if it's kind of fiction. Can I pick a poetry and a fiction book?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to take Carl Sandburg's book length poem, The People Yes.
Okay.
So that's book one. And then book two is between Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See and East of Eden. Oof. I think I would go with East of Eden because I think that one could run me out for a while. I think I could read that multiple times, whereas All the Light I could probably only read like 6 or 7 times.
And then you'd be tossing it in the fire.
And then I would be done. I'd be using it for fire
Gotcha.
starter.
Well, Seth, you certainly could have done something else today. I certainly appreciate you. Hopefully, I've made this fun and asked some good
It
questions.
was, yeah, it was awesome.
Uh, I just want to, thank you. And I want to thank you in this context. We sometimes don't think about time and as a resource and how precious it is, and we don't get it back. And you gave me your time today, and the others who are going to watch or listen. So thanks a bunch for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on. It was fun. It was a good time.
Thanks, brother. Thanks, Seth.
All right,
Appreciate it.
do it again.